In this video, you'll learn modern HTML and CSS by building a simple but realistic project from scratch. So I'm going to use Chrome. If you look at the statistics, most people in the world use Chrome. We need a program to write the code in. Now, the most popular one is Visual Studio Code, right? So you can just Google that. So to install Visual Studio Code, just click on the button here and it should pop up in a moment and you can just go through the steps. All right, so I opened up my code editor and I have this welcome screen that I can click away. And if you're following along, if you're coding along, the first step is to open a folder. So you can go on this icon, open folder, or click on file and open folder. And you can pick an already existing folder, or what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new folder here. On my desktop, I will call this HTML CSS tutorial. I'm going to select that folder and open this up in my code editor here, right? So now this project is opened up. That's really the first step. Now I get this weird, do you trust the authors? Yes, I trust them. And I get the the welcome screen again. I'm going to click it away. And the first step is to create an HTML file, right? So now we've opened up this folder. Now we can create files in the folder. So we can create a file by clicking on this icon. And the first file that we're going to create is an HTML file. We're going to call that index.html. Why index? Well, this is a bit of a remnant from the past and people have just stuck with this. So this is a common name that developers use for their HTML files. Now we're also going to write CSS, of course. Let's also create a file for that. So we're going to say style.css. Now you can name this whatever you want, by the way. It can be styles.css or stylesheet.css or main.css. As long as these extensions are .html and .css, it will work the way we intend this to work, right? You can also see the code editor automatically sees what kind of file this is and it creates these little icons, it adds these little icons in front of them. Okay, I'm going to close the sidebar here. I can do this by clicking and dragging it to the left. And let's start here in the HTML. So in HTML, I can write HTML, and then we want the second option here. And if we press tab, Emmet will give us an HTML boilerplate. This is what you would do in the real world. You wouldn't create this from scratch, right? It just takes too much time. It's unnecessary. So at the top, we see a doc type declaration. This means this lets the browser know we want to use the latest HTML standards. And then we have HTML elements. So HTML is basically just a tree of elements. So the root element here is this HTML element, and it has this lang attribute. So this page is in English. Now in the HTML, we have two elements. So we have the head element, right? This is the head element, and then we have a body element. Now here, when you create a boilerplate, it's not indented, right? So this maybe looks a bit more how it's supposed to look. So the head, in this element here, we have meta information. So this is information about the information. So here we have some meta tags. This is for the character set. This is for Internet Explorer, and this has to do with responsiveness. We'll talk more about responsiveness. This is not really important to understand right now, but we want to leave this here. All right, so then in the body, we're going to have the actual content. Right, so here, this will be the actual information that we want to display to the user. Now let's also change the title of this project, of this website. We can call that budget app. And let's add something to the body. So if we want to create an element, we have opening and closing tags, right? So let's say we want to create a paragraph element on the page. We can write this opening tag, and here in the code editor, it will automatically give us this closing tag. Right? So it's just the same P with just a /. And then in there, we can write some text. Hello world, right? So I'm going to place my code editor here. And now let's try opening this up in the browser. So what you can do is you can click and drag this HTML file onto the top part of your browser, and you should see something on the page like this, right? Okay, so now let's try styling this paragraph element. So now we need to write some CSS. So in CSS, you need to select the elements that you want to style. So here we only have one element here in the body. So let's try selecting this first. So we can select this element by using its tag. This is a P tag, so we can write P. And then you have opening and closing curly braces. And then in here, we have a property, for example, color. And we can set that to a value red. And then a semicolon at the end. If we save this and now try refreshing, we don't see anything. Why not? Well, remember, we give this HTML file to the browser. The browser is going to go line by line, right, top to bottom, but nowhere here does it see anything with CSS, right? So it doesn't know about its existence. Right? So you can see HTML as sort of the entry point. And if you have other resources like CSS or JavaScript or a fav icon or a font or icons, you have to link to that here from the HTML. So it starts with the HTML, and then in turn, the HTML file will link to other resources. So here in the head, we can link to a CSS file. So we can say link, press tab, and here we can, it wants to know the path. So let me make this a little bit wider. It wants to know the path to that HTML file, to that CSS file. It's in the same folder. So we can just write style.css. Now, if we refresh, the CSS is indeed applied to the page, and we see indeed the color of this paragraph is now red. Right, so this entire thing is called a declaration. This is a property. This is the value for that property. And this entire thing is called a rule set. And this is called the selector. We can also have other selectors. So in the past, people used IDs a lot, right? So if you could have some kind of ID, right, you can write an ID here in the opening tag here, and you would need to use the hashtag, and that would be text, right? So if I save here and refresh, it's still red. These days, it's common to select by class. So instead of ID, we have class, and we can say text. Instead of hashtag, it's a dot, right? So if I save here and refresh, it still works, right? So with saving, I can hold Control S. You can see if a file has changed with this yellow dot here, it means it has changed. So then I can hold Control S, and I need to refresh to apply this to the page. Right, so that's HTML and CSS in a nutshell. Let's now try creating this project here. So I'm going to remove this from the CSS. I'm also going to remove this. So we've seen the paragraph element now, but there are many other tags. So it's not only P, we also have span, right? We also have div, we have header, we have section, we have footer, we have main. These are some common ones, and we will see most of these in this project, right? So don't worry, let's just start building this project, and you'll pick this up as we go along. Okay, so let's add the HTML necessary for this, and let's start with this left piece first, and then later we'll do the transactions piece. So here on the left side, how can we build it? All right, so typically we want to have an element that holds everything here, right? So a typical element or tag for that is the div. So we can write div like this, or if you already know you want to give it a class name, which we do, we can just write div dot and then a class for this. We'll call it app, press tab. We'll give you the entire HTML element with the class, right? This is an easy way of quickly adding some elements with a class. This element will hold everything. Div stands for divider, right? So this will hold everything. And then let's start at the top. So now we need to have another element, another div, another divider that will hold everything here in the top. So we can say div dot top, press tab, right? That's for the top. Then let's see, we have some kind of overview here, right? So here there's going to be another divider, another div that holds everything here in this overview. So we have div dot overview, tab, okay? So that's one part in the app. And then we have a form actually. So a form usually has some kind of input. These are inputs and a button, right? And these descriptions of the inputs, these are actually called labels, right? So here after the interview or after the overview, we have a form, right? So a form, we can just write form, and we will actually just give it a class of form. Okay, now here when you do that, it's going to ask for the action. So this means when you submit the form, where should it submit this form data to? What's the address of the server? So this is something that you would use in the past, but these days we handle all of that with JavaScript. So we can just remove this action for now. And I will open this up as well. Right, so this is the structure of that piece, the left piece here. Let's continue here, your balance and then a number. So here we're going to have a so-called heading. So we have H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. And H1 is the most important, H2 is the one that's most important after that. Right, so it's a hierarchy. So the most important heading on the page is actually your balance here. So we would use an H1 tag for that. And we can give it a class of first dash heading, tab. And here we can call it your balance. Right, let me make it a little bit wider. Right, and below there we have a number. Now this number needs some styling, so we're going to give that a tag as well. But it doesn't need anything specific, right? So we can also just use a span. This is very similar to div. Div is something that will take the entire width, right? So the div will really sort of kick everything out. A span is more suitable if you want to have something in the same line. Like usually it's wrapping just one number, for example. And we can use a span here, and we can call this balance dash number. So here it will be 4700. All right, so let's actually save here and let's just see what we have so far. This is what we have so far. So this H1 is already a pretty big text. So the browser actually already styles some of this out of the box, right? And I'm zooming in here just for the tutorial. You don't have to do that in case you're following along. I'm just zooming in here so you can see what I'm doing, what's going on here. Okay, so then we have this overview part, income and expenses. So let's see, those are two things, right? So here On the left side, we have income. On the other side, we have expenses. So here we want to have another two. We could use divs. There's another tag though that you also see sometimes, which is section. Section is almost the same as div, but section is more commonly used if everything in there is semantically related to each other. So here on the left side, we have income. We have a heading. This will be a heading, income, and then a number. These two things are connected to each other. They're part of the same overall semantic entity. So you could use div here, but ideally you use a tag in HTML that is semantically correct, or at least you want to add as much semantic meaning to this as possible. So here section would be a good idea. We can actually just give it a class of section as well. May look a bit strange. Why are we giving this element the same class name as its tag name? Well, this has to do with being consistent in how we select our elements. So if we just select everything by class, yeah, sometimes it's going to be the same name as the tag name, so it looks a bit strange, but it's also nice to have a consistent way of selecting our elements in the CSS. Okay, we could also give this. We can also give this div the tag of section, by the way, right? And even the app here would also be fine to use the section tag for that, right? In the real world, people don't care that much. Developers don't care that much about the tag name, but I could also use div here instead of section. Okay, so here we have an h2. This is going to be a heading that's slightly less important than the other one. So I'll call it second heading, and this will say income. And then we'll have another span here with a class of number, but it's also going to have another class, number. It's not just a number, it's a number dash dash income. Right, so here it's going to have two classes. It's going to get some base styles. But in our JavaScript, we need to be able to select this element as well. And this is because both of these numbers are going to get the same class, both the number class. We need to be able to select these elements individually as well. So they also need to get a unique class. So we'll call that number dash dash income. This is called a modifier class. We're going to use a particular way of naming our classes here, a systematic way. It's part of my CSS course as well. It's called a BEM. So this number here is 5000. And then here we have another section, the class of section. And also we may as well just copy everything here from the other one. Let's let's select all of this and just paste that in here. And this is going to be expenses with number dash dash expenses. And this number initially is negative 300. Okay, I'm going to save here, refresh, let's see what we have. Okay, so now we have this. Okay, let's continue with the form here. We have two inputs here and a label for each one, and then a button at the bottom. So let's see. We have an input here, input of type text. Actually, let's say input dot input, and specifically it's the input dot. There's another class here. Input. It's for the description. Right, so another modify class here. So here we have input with two classes, a base class of input, but then also a unique class, so we can select this in our JavaScript. We're not going to write JavaScript in this video, but it's part of another video, so we need to give this a unique class for that as well. And the type is text. So if I refresh here, you can see this. We get an input here, and we can write text here, right? Now for the other one, this actually needs to be an amount. So you can see we also get this thingy on the right side here. So we have another input, so we can write input and we give it the same classes except for the modifier class. So this should be input dash dash amount, press tab. And now this type here should actually be number, right? So if I save here and refresh, you can see I have another one here, but you can see now we get this thingy on the right side. And I can also not write everything, only numbers, right? And then at the bottom, we want to have a button. So button with a class of btn, and we'll say submit in here. We can also give this a type. So we can give it a type of submit. So when you click a button with type submit in a form, the browser will try to submit this form, right, to whatever you put in the action, right? If you're using that, the address here, we're not using that here. We're gonna, we would deal with that in JavaScript these days, but it will try to submit the form. Okay, so if I refresh here, this is what we have now. Now we still need to have a description for each of these inputs, right? So we have description here and also amount. So here, typically you use a label for that. So label, that's gonna ask us for which input this is. So here, if you want to connect them, you have to give the input an ID. So we can give it simply an ID of description, and then we can say this label is for an input with description. Okay, and then the actual text here should be description. All right, that's what we actually see here. So we say description, and let's see if we save and refresh here. Now we see this. Now one of the advantages of using a label is that when you click the label, the input will also become focused. Okay, let's also add a label for the other input. Label for, well, let's call this amount, right? Just for amount. And the actual text here should be amount. And then let's see, plus in parentheses, plus for income or minus for expense. Oh, let's make this a little bit wider. Plus for income or minus for expense. Right, so now this is connected. And actually, let's also give these labels a class. We forgot to do that. So I will give this a class of, right, so I only have to write CL. And my code editor already suggested for me, so you can just press tab. So here we want to get class label. And we want to get the same, we want to add the same for the other one. So we can just paste that right here. Now all of these things in the closing, in the opening tag here are called attributes. Right, so class is a really common attribute. For is an attribute, ID is an attribute, type is an attribute, class is an attribute. Right, so make sure you have this in case you're coding along. And let's also make sure you have the class here. All right, so now let's see what we have. So now we have this, and this is not really pleasant to consume. Right, so in the body here, we're adding the raw information to the page. This is not pleasant to consume, this information. It's also not, it's not pleasant to interact with either. Right, so it's really important that you apply the styling. It can really make or break an application or website. Okay, so we are linking to some external resource. We can link to external resources here in the HTML. And right now we've only linked to our own style sheet, but sometimes you need other resources as well, like a font. That's actually what we're going to do here. So if we go to fonts.google.com, you can see all sorts of very nice fonts that Google is hosting. So the one that we're going to use is called Inter. This is a very popular font. A lot of designers use it. It's my go-to font. It's very popular. It's very nice, professional looking. You can click on the font, and here it will show you some information. Now, unfortunately, I always found this website a little bit confusing. I think it could be clearer, but here you have the font weights, right? So you don't get all the font weights out of the box because maybe you're not using, for example, this thin one. So it would only take up extra space, extra bytes. So you have to specify here which ones you want. So I'm going to pick 300 and it's, let's see, it's in the way. So I'm going to close this for now. I also want 400. I want 500, 600, 700, and let's say 800. So I'm picking everything from 300 to 800. Then I can click on the icon again, and it shows you here how to include that. So here it's just a link. We can press all of this stuff, and let's see that we can go back to our HTML here. I'm going to paste it in front of our own style sheet here. I can just paste it right here. So what you get is actually 3 link tags. The first 2 are actually just for optimizations. The third one is what will actually import the font. Okay, now if you do that, and refresh, it won't work yet, right? So it won't automatically make this font, right? So we will have to do that explicitly in our CSS, right? So I can close this now. All right, let's continue with our CSS. So where do we want to start, right? So this is what we want, right? We'll do the transaction section in a minute. This is what we want. So let's see. I like to start off with a so-called reset. So we can write a comment in CSS like this, / reset, and then reset, and then */ and a comment is just for the developer to add some structure or an explanation for something. It will not be actual CSS. It will not be run as code here, right? So reset means undoing some styles, because if you look at this, the browser automatically adds some styles. It adds a particular font size to this H1 element and also to these H2s. Right, and also add some spacing here. It's actually margin, right? They're not sitting against each other. There's some spacing between them. So these browsers, even if you have no CSS, there will still be some styling, just to not make it look even worse than this. Now, often we don't want that styling. We want to add. We want to start from a clean slate. So what we can do is we can select all elements on the page with the universal selector. And then in here, we're just going to set all the margin to 0. So if we do this and refresh, you can see all of the space has been removed. We also want to commonly remove all the padding. And then also very common in a reset is to set the box sizing property to border box. This is actually very advanced. It's not really important to understand right now, but if you set a height or width on an element, does that include the size of a padding and a border? And the answer with this is yes. The default is no. with the S, it actually makes it easier to work with. Okay, so that's a reset. Let's copy this comment here. Let's add some base styles to the page. So base styles. And actually, before we do that, I quickly want to show you what we just did with the margin and padding. So what you can do is you can right click on the page. You can also do it on a particular element, right click inspect. And what you will see here, let me make this a little bit bigger. So what you will see here is actually the HTML of the page with some information about it. So here we have this first heading, for example, and every element on the page has a box model, as it's called. So here you can see this H1 has a particular height and width. Right, you can see that here if you select this element here, and we see the CSS that's being applied to it, right? So this is already coming from the browser, right? So it's already, the browser is already user agent style sheet, as it's called. The browser is already selecting all the H1s and applying all this stuff here. It's not really important for now. And now it is also applying this stuff from our own style sheet here, right? Now here it will show you the box model of every element on the page, right? So every element has this box model. So you can see all the elements are basically just a bunch of boxes, each with different sizes, right? So this H1 right now has a width of 549 pixels and a height of 37 pixels, right? That's just coming from its text, right? So its content here, it's just from the font, just from the font essentially, the font size. If we undo the reset here, right? So if I'm going to select everything here, I'm going to comment it out with control / so it becomes a comment. If I do this and refresh again, now you can see this first heading gets space again, there's space again, and this is actually coming from the browser, right? So here the browser adds margin, right? Not really important to understand this weird M and block, that's not important. The fact is that it has margin, and this margin comes from the browser, and we can see that in the box model, right? So it has its own size and it has margin here, right? Now we can also quickly add some styling to play around. So maybe it should also have padding. We can say it should have, let's say 10 pixels of padding all around it, right? So we can quickly add, we can play around with the CSS in the browser in these browser developer tools. So now if we go here, we can see it has its own box from, its font size just from its font. And then around there you have padding, right? Around there you have the size of a border, and around there you have margin, right? So this is the box model in CSS. Every element has this, right? So it's padding, border, margin. So margin is sort of space between elements, and then border and padding are seen as part of the element, right? So that's just a quick side note. It's an important concept. I'm gonna Control Z to undo that because we do want to remove all of that default styling. All right, so then let's add some base styles here. So we can select the body element just by its tag name because it's just a one-off element. It's a one-time selector here. The body is unique, so that's not an issue. You can say font family to apply the font, right? So we can say enter, and if enter is not available for whatever reason, maybe the Google font server is down, then we can say comma, pick any sans serif font that is available on the user's computer. So then if we refresh, you can see the font has changed and already looks better in my opinion. All right, let's also set a background color for this page. So it's now plain white. It hurts the eyes a little bit. So we can use RGB, you can use hex code. We can say 225, 227, and 230. This will actually be a bit of a blue color. This is very popular these days. So if you have some kind of gray color, it's popular to add a little bit of blue in there to make it look a bit cooler. If you just have pure grays, it can make the page look a bit plain. So this is a common design tactic that designers are using. Okay, so now let's actually give this app this this size and this white background color. So let's see, we can select the app, right? .app, it's a class, and it should get a white background color. So it's just FFF 6 times actually, but if the last 3 are the same as the first 3 with these hex codes, you can leave the last 3 off. So it's just 3 times F. Right, so now we have this. I'm actually going to zoom out a little bit because it was a bit too big. Right, so we have this, and it should get a width of 400 pixels. Right, so if I do this and save and refresh, we get this, and a height of 490 pixels. Save, refresh. Okay, we can make the borders curved with border radius. So we can say border radius should be 8 pixels. Okay, And we also want to add a box shadow. So if you look here in the example, it has a bit of a shadow here. And so we can just say box shadow as it's called. Now the box shadow here, if you look closely, it has a bit of a vertical direction, right? So you don't see the box shadow here at the top, or very little, but you see more of it at the bottom. And then horizontally speaking, it's equal, right? So here with box shadow, the first number is to specify if there should be any horizontal movement, right? So no, it should be 0 movement. And if you have 0 pixels, you can also just say 0, right? So you can say 0 pixels or just 0. The second number is for the vertical direction. So here we do want to have a little bit, it should sit a little bit lower. It looks a bit better. So we say 3 pixels downwards. And then the blur, right? So how blurry should the shadow be? We will say 4 pixels. And then the color of the box shadow, well, it should be black, but it should be a little bit see-through. So we're going to use RGBA in this time. So we can say black. So we should get 0 for each color. And then 15% opacity. So we'll say 0.15. So if we save here and refresh, you can see we have now a nice box shadow here. Okay, now if we look here, sitting in the top left corner here, we want to center it on the page, right? So if we look here, all of this is centered. So this is a layout problem. And whenever you run into a layout issue, the first thing you want to think about is Flexbox. So with Flexbox, it's actually a very important concept. I would say it's the most important concept in CSS. It's part of my CSS course as well. We practice a lot with it. So with Flexbox, you always want to identify the parent element of the layout of the element that you want to create a layout for. So here we want to center this app. So we need to identify its parent element here in the HTML hierarchy, right? So here the parent element is actually the body element, right? It's just an element like any other element. And what you want to do here is on that parent element, you want to say display flex. This will unlock the Flexbox functionalities. Right? If I refresh here, nothing changes yet. But what I can do now is I can use justify content to center it horizontally, right? So now it's centered horizontally, right? Now, if we want to center it vertically in the body as well, we do need to make sure that the body extends all the way to the bottom of our viewport, as it's called, right? So this area here of the website that we see here is called the viewport. It does not include the address bar. It's just this visible area of the web page, and the body right now does not extend all the way to the bottom, although you would think that because the background color does cover everything, but that's just because it's the body. So the browser will automatically make the background color of the body the size of the entire viewport. The body element is actually only as big as the app here now. So we want to make the body at least, we can say minimum height. So it should be at least, well, 100% of the viewport height. Right, so this is a bit of an advanced topic, viewport units, but we can say the body should be at least as big, 100% of the viewport height. Now, if it's bigger, we just get a scroll bar, that's fine, right? So it can be bigger, but it should be at least as big. And then what you can do, right? So now the body will be the complete height here. And then we can use align items center with in Flexbox to also center it vertically. Right, now it's a little bit annoying that every time we make a change, I have to save the file and then refresh. Right, so there is actually an extension in Visual Studio Code. You can click here for extensions. I have a bunch of extensions installed already. Now there is one called Live Server, a very popular one. If you search for Live Server here, you'll see this one by Ritwik Day, and you can install that. So you can click on install here, and once you've installed it, you can see it has been installed more than 30 million times. Once you have installed that, you will see something here at the bottom, go live. So I've already installed it, so I don't need to do that again. So you can click on go live, or you can right click on the HTML file and say open with live server. So I'm going to click there. It will open up the project in a new window, so it should pop up in any second here. Yeah, so here it pops up and it gives you this project on a new address here with 127 blah blah blah. I'm going to copy the address here and just paste that right here to put it on a live server. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see what we're doing. And I'm going to close the sidebar here again. I can also just say Control B to close the sidebar. The advantage of this is now whenever I make a change, let's say I change the background color to black. If I now save here, it automatically updates the page, right? So if I Control Z here and Control S to save, it automatically updates. I don't have to manually refresh every time. Okay, so let's see. Let's continue now with the top part here. You can see it has a slightly different background color. So let's see. We gave that a class of top, and in there we have first heading and balance number. So let's just select all of that. So we have dot top, dot first heading, and dot balance dash number, right? And then in the top, we have that background color, right? So this doesn't change anything. Now let's add the background color to the top. You can also write background color, by the way, but background is just a shorthand. So we can say hashtag F2, F2, F2. So we get a different color. We'll give it a height of 100 pixels. And now we run into a layout problem again, because now we want to center these two in that top div, right? So this is a layout problem. So we have these two, we want to center these two in this top div. So the parent element, right? So we want to think flexbox. We now identify the parent element, because flexbox is always about a parent element and its child elements. So the parent element here is this top div. So what we want to do is say display flex. And when you do that, the default layout in Flexbox is actually that if you have multiple elements, they're going to sit in the same row, right? So horizontally, they're going to be next to each other. But we actually want to keep that vertical flow. They should sit below each other. So we can change that, flex direction. The default is actually row, but we can also change it to column. So then we still get this vertical flow. Now, it looks like nothing changed here, but we actually unlocked the Flexbox functionalities here. So we can use justify content and align items again. So it was a bit confusing because previously we used justify content center to center it horizontally. However, if you use flex direction column, justify content now is for the vertical axis. So if I save here, you can see it's centered vertically, and now it's align items. That is for the horizontal axis, right? So it flips when you use flex direction column. It's a bit tricky perhaps. All right, now also because we've given this a background color, it's a bit difficult to see, but it's pointy now. It's sort of overflowing this curved border of the overall app. So what we can do is we can go to this app and we can just say anything that overflows it, just hide that. Right, so then that part of the background will just be hidden. Okay, let's style this first heading here. It should actually get a smaller font size. So this is an H1 element. The browsers make these usually pretty big. We're going to make this a little bit smaller. And we'll make it uppercase. So we can say text transform. And I don't have to write out the complete property name every time. So if I say text dash T, it will already suggest it for me. So I can just press tab. And it should be uppercase. So I only have to write U. It will already suggest it for me. Press tab and save. And we'll see this. Also, these H1s usually are pretty bold. So we're going to change the font weight. So I can write font W, press tab. And then it's 500. We're also going to add some margin on the bottom, so it's not sitting against the number. So I can write margin B, tab, 3 pixels. Okay, let's then style the balance number. So this should actually be pretty big because it's an important number. Font S, press tab, 30 pixels. And then we have font weight, font W, press tab, 700. That's so quite bold. Okay, so that's the top part. Let's continue now with this overview part. So let's see, we have overview, and in there we have a section, second heading, and number. Let's just select all of this to get it over with. So we have dot overview, we have dot section, and we have second heading, and we have number. Now these also have an individual class, number income and number expenses. We don't need that in our CSS, that's more for the JavaScript. Because in JavaScript we actually also use these CSS selectors, right? So that we need to add a class here if we want to select it by class in the JavaScript. All right, let's take a look. Let's actually start with the second heading here, because these headings are too big right now. So this is what we want. Now let's see, that's a font size, so font S of 14 pixels. And then a font weight, font W, press tab of 600. And we'll say text transform uppercase again, text T, uppercase. And can look good sometimes is if you have uppercase, you can increase the letter spacing. So you can say letter S, press tab, and it's just going to be a little bit. So it's going to be a little bit more letter spacing. And we'll add some margin on the bottom as well of 3 pixels. Okay, now in this overall overview, we want to have a border here, right? So there should be a border around all of this. So we'll say border one pixel wide. It should be a solid border, not dashed or anything. And it's going to be a black border, but a little bit lower opacity. So we're going to use RGBA again with 0 for all colors. And then the last one is for the alpha channel, the opacity. So we actually see a border now. But now the overview section, is spanning the entire width here, because it's a so-called block level element. Divs are block level elements and they take up the entire width by default. We don't want that. We want it to be about 80% of the width, not 100%. Right, so a block level element will take up the entire width available to it. And we also have inline level elements. So these spans, for example, they are inline level elements by default. They do not take up the entire line. They will only take up the width that, well, its content takes up. That's the main difference between div and span. Okay, now this overview is now 80% wide, but it's sitting against the left side here. We want it to be centered in here. So if you've given this a width, what you can do is you can use margin with 0 on top and bottom, and then auto on left and right side, right? So if you have two values, the first one is top and bottom, the second one is for the right and left side. If you do that, it will actually add as much margin on either side to make it centered, right? So this is a quick trick of centering something horizontally at least. Okay, so now we have these two sections in here, right? And they should be next to each other horizontally. Right, so that's a layout problem. So we want to think flexbox. So we have these two sections. The parent element is the overview. So we would say display flex on the parent element. And now they're sitting next to each other, which is actually what we want this time. And now what we also want is they both take up half the size. Right, that's also a layout problem. Right, so sizing is also part of layouts. So we also have something, a solution for this in Flexbox. So here, these sections should both take up an equal portion of the available space here. So we can use the flex property for them, and we can give this any number, 1 or 4. What this means is what portion of the available space should this element take up. Right? Remember, they both have the class section. So now they're both getting this flex, and then they both get the same number. And because of that, they both will take up the same available space. Right? So this expenses is now all the space here, and this income is now all the space here. Let's also give them some padding. So we'll say padding 20 pixels on the top and 0 on the right and left side. And then of course everything in this section should also be centered. Right, so this heading and the number should be centered. So let's see, the parent element is the section. So we can also just use Flexbox in here again, right? You can nest them. Now the default layout is that they're gonna sit next to each other horizontally. We don't want that. We want to keep the vertical flow, right? So we're gonna say flex direction column. And then we can just use justify content and align items again to center it. Right, just like before. Okay. Now we want to give the one of these a border in the center, right? So we want to get this border here. And actually, let's give this overview a bit of margin on the top or bottom so it has some space to breathe. So we'll add some margin on the top of 30 pixels, and we'll deal with the form below it in a second. So now let's say we want to add this border in between. So we have to pick one of these. Let's pick the second one, and let's add some bordering on the left side. So let's see, we have section here. So what we can say is select the section, but not both of them, only the one that is a second child element, right? So this one is a second, this is a child element and it's the second one, right? So this is the first child element and this is the second one. So what we can do is we can say an element with a class section that is an nth child. So we can make this 1 or 2 or 3. Here we want the second one. So we select the element with a class of section that is a second child element. And we can just add a border on the left side of, let's say, 1 pixel solid. And it's going to be, well, a bit see-through again. So it's going to be black, 0, 0, 0, with 0.15 opacity. Right, so then we have this border. Okay, so that looks about right. So now we need to continue with the form. So let's see, in the form we have form, label, we have these inputs and a button. So let's just select all of them. And actually we didn't use number here. So we could remove it or we could just leave it because maybe later we decide it should add some styling. Let's just remove it for now because we didn't use it. Then we have dot form, dot label, dot input, and the button, right? So dot btn. All right, so the form should also not span the entire width here. So we want to restrict the width here to 80%, right? Percentage is always the parent element, right? So it's going to be 80% of the width of the parent element, right? So this form, the parent element is this app. So the width of the app, 80% of that is going to be the size of the form. That will restrict this part. And then of course we also want to center it. So we can use the trick, 0 on top and bottom and auto on left and right side. Now we do want to have these inputs span the entire width here. So let's go to input here and we'll say width 100%. Okay. Now these inputs get some default styling. Right, so you can see it already has a border, for example. And same goes for button elements. They already get a background color here and also a border. And actually their font is also different. And we don't want this default styling for the inputs or the buttons. So let's go back to our reset. And here we can select all input elements on the page, right? Selecting by tag here, all input elements, we can remove the border. We can say border none. We can say the font should be inherited because also in inputs you get a different font. So if I comment this out, we don't see the input properly here, but we'll change that in a second. Here, this is actually a different font. This is using the default font. It's not using the inter font right now. So we need to we need to tell the browser everything related to the font, which is a shorthand. It's not only font family, it's also font size. Right? Everything related to the font, this is a shorthand for all of them. Inherit that. Right? So it's gonna inherit that from other elements. And actually, let's give it a border. Instead of mon, we'll say it should be a solid border. And actually, let's do that below here. This shouldn't be part of the reset. Right, so here it should be more about resetting the styles. So we just want to remove the border for now. And we want to inherit the font. Okay, and then for the button, we want to remove the background. So we'll say background none. All the buttons on the page, remove the background, and also remove the border. And also you can see the font here is slightly different. So here we will also say font inherit. Okay, so now we have reset those elements as well. Let's go back here and continue styling them. So the inputs should get a border. So we'll say 1 pixel solid, RGBA, and should be black, but with 15% opacity. The borders right now are very cornery, so we're gonna make them a bit curved, 4 pixels. And we'll add some padding as well. 10 pixels on top and bottom, 15 pixels on the right and left side. Okay. And let's see, the button here should get a padding as well of 15 pixels on top and bottom and 25 pixels on the right and left side. Now what we also want is when we go over here with our mouse that the cursor becomes a pointer. So we can say cursor pointer. Right, so now when we hover the button here, it will become a pointer. Now the button of course should get a color. So we'll say background and it's going to be hashtag 007 2E4. Okay, it should span the entire width with 100%. And it shouldn't be so cornery. It should actually be a pill shape. Very common shape in CSS. So how do you create that? Well, you can use border radius with just a very large number, right? So as long as there's a large number, it will just be pill shape. The color of the text in there should actually be white and should be uppercase. So text T uppercase. And we'll add some margin on the top so it's not sitting against the inputs. Okay, let's also style these labels a little bit. So I will say display block, because these labels are inline level elements by default. So now we're going to make them a block level element because we want to add some margin on the bottom of 5 pixels. You cannot do that with inline level elements, so we have to convert it to a block level element first. Okay, so now it's sitting here, it's sitting against the overview section here, but it should actually just sit at the bottom here. Right, so we could add margin on the top, but how much margin? We don't know exactly. It's better to just force this to sit at the bottom of this part here. So there's a layout issue, so we can solve that with Flexbox. So this app here, let's see. So we have to form the parent element as the app. Right, so we go to this app and we'll say display flex. Now the default with Flexbox is that everything is going to sit on the same row. So it's going to look like this now. We want to keep that vertical flow. Right, so we're just going to change this column again. So everything still looks the same, but now what we can do is we can go to the form, and the trick here is to use margin top in combination with auto. So margin, of course, is not from Flexbox. We can use margin outside of Flexbox, but if you use it in combination with auto, it will add as much margin here as possible, which will push this to the bottom. Right, so then if we go back to app again, we can just add some padding on the bottom. Padding bottom of 35 pixels. Okay, now this These inputs are still a bit too close. So let's go to input here, a bit of scrolling here, bear with me. So input, we also want to add some margin on the bottom here. So we'll add 10 pixels on the bottom. Okay, cool. So now what we need to do is when we hover this button, the color slightly changes, right? So this is another important part of CSS, animations and transitions. So how do you do that? When you hover it, it becomes a different color. We want to change the background property here. So we say btn in the hover state. So you can say colon hover. And then here we can just change the background property to a different color. So here it's going to be, let's see, it's going to be hashtag 006.8cf. So here we're saying the button in the hover state should get this background color. So now when I hover this, you can see it becomes a different color, but it's not very smooth. Right, so to make it smooth, you have to go to the normal rule set here, not in the hover state, just a normal one. And we can use transition here. And we can say if the background property gets changed, that should happen in 0.3 seconds, let's say. So here, if we now do it, you can see it's very smooth, right? And you can say only for the background, but maybe if we change the width or something else as well, maybe we want to do it for any property. So for all property that gets changed, it shouldn't happen instantly, it should happen in 0.3 seconds. And so now it still works. This is more common in practice. All right, so that's the app part or the left side here. Now let's also add this history of transactions. So this is going to be a heading, and then we have individual items for each transaction here. If you hover the transaction, you should see a delete button, right? They will also have a color on the right side indicating whether it's an income or an expense. Let's add the HTML for that. So here we have the app, right? So after that, now we're going to have a section for the transaction. So I will use a section tag here with a class of transactions-section. And then in there, we're going to have that heading, right? Transactions will actually be the third most important heading on the page. So we're going to use H3 and we'll call it third heading. And it should just be transactions. Okay. And then we will have a list. So in HTML, if you have a list, we have UL for unordered or OL for ordered list. Typically, you want to use UL, meaning the order is not really important, right? Unordered. And we'll give it a class of transactions. Now in a list, you have LIs, list items. So we say LI, and this will be the actual transaction, right? So we're going to have two transactions here, for salary and groceries. We'll do one and then we'll duplicate it. So in the transaction, we have a description and a number. So we'll use a span for that. So actually we can use a heading for this as well. So let's use a heading. No, let's just use text because it's not really a heading, right? So sometimes it's a bit, you could argue for both sides about the tag to use. We'll just use a span for now. We'll say transaction underscore text, right? So we're using BEM methodology here. So if you have some kind of element that is connected to a block here, it's better to use underscore. And it's a systematic way of naming your classes. So here in the example, we use salary, and then we also have an amount. And we'll also use span for that, transaction underscore amount. And this one is plus 5,000. And there's also a button, the delete button. So we'll use button for that, and it's going to be transaction underscore btn. And we'll just write a capital X here. This is going to be invisible initially. Only when you hover the transaction will you see it. Okay. We also have a modifier class. So this is going to be transaction dash income. And this is going to be an income. And now we have another item in this list. But this is going to be expense. So we need to change this into expense. And this is for groceries, right? Groceries. And here the amount is a negative number, negative 300, and the transaction button will stay the same. Okay, now when we do this, it's going to look terrible. Well, it's not horrible, but of course it should look better. Okay, so if you have this in case you're coding along, let's now go to the CSS again. So now we have this. So where do we start? Well, this list actually gets some default styling. You can see the bullet points, and we don't want those bullet points. So with a list, typically you also want to reset that. So let's go to our reset here. We'll select every UL element on the page. We only have one now, but in case we have more, and we'll say list style. We don't want any. We don't want those bullet points. Okay. So then let's actually write the selectors here. So we have transactions section, third heading, transactions. Okay, quite a few. So let's just write it all in one go here to get it over with. So we have dot transactions dash section. Then we have third dash heading. Then we have transaction singular. And we also have those modifier classes. This time we actually do want to use that here in our CSS because of the border. Transaction dash dash expense. And what we also want to use here is transaction amount and also transaction underscore underscore BTN. Right, so for quite a few classes here using the BEM methodology, that's why we have these underscores and these dashes here. This is a really nice system of naming your classes, especially as your project becomes bigger. You do want to have a system of naming your classes, otherwise you're going to have all sorts of clashes. Accidentally going to have the same class names. So this solves a lot of issues actually. And we also select everything by class. So this solves a lot of issues in CSS with specificity. Right, so we're keeping it very flat as it's called. It's a bit of an advanced topic, not really important to understand right now. Okay, now it's sitting against the app part here. So let's actually just add some margin on the left here. We can say margin left 30 pixels. Okay. And let's style the third heading. So the third heading should get a font size of 14 pixels. And should be uppercase, so text transform uppercase. And we'll add some letter spacing of 1 pixel. And the font weight should be 600, right? So you can see how fast you can code if you use these shortcuts. Font W, press tab, 600. And let's see, margin bottom. Margin, you can just write margin B, press tab, 12 pixels. And that's about it for this third heading. Okay, now these transaction items should get a white background color and a very slight box shadow as well, just to separate it a little bit better from the background. So we'll say background should just be white. It should get some padding, 15 pixels on top and bottom, 20 pixels on the right and left side. They should get the complete width of this section. So we'll give this section a width of 250 pixels. And so they will actually grow to take up that space. It's good. Now to separate them a little bit better from each other, we're going to add some margin on the bottom of 8 pixels. We'll also give them a border radius of 3 pixels. Now to separate from the background a little bit better, we're going to give it a very slight box shadow as well. So 0 pixels, we can write 0 pixels or just 0. If the value is 0, you don't have to specify the unit. 3 pixels downward movement, 4 pixel blur, and then we'll use RGBA. So it's going to be 0, it's going to be black, but with 0.05 opacity this time. So not 15, but 5%. And that already makes it look significantly better, I think. Now, when we hover this, we do want to see a cursor pointer as well, because we should be able to delete this if we click this. So it needs to indicate to the user that we can click this. Right, you can actually use the hover state for that as well, or you can actually just specify this here in the normal rule set. Okay, so then we have this transaction income. So this should get a border on the right of green color. Actually, we can we usually specify the size first. So 5 pixel thick, solid border, and it's a green color. You can also write this in a different order. Okay, and then this one, the expenses should get a red color. So 5 pixels, solid border, red color. Okay, so now this button here, we can see this X, that's the button, and it's taking up space right now. We don't want it to take up space. So let's see, we can say position absolute. It will take it out of the normal flow, meaning it's not going to take up any space. And now we can also position it in the center. So we're going to say 50% from the top and 50% from the left. But the left of what exactly? Well, it should be relative to this transaction element. So when you use position absolute, you do want to have a reference point. So you can do that by setting the position of this element to relative, and we'll position it 50% from the top of that element and 50% from the left of that element. And you can see this X is now sitting 50% from the top, but it's not in the center, right? So the center of itself is not coinciding with the center here. So the trick here, you need to pull it back a little bit because now it's taking 50% of the size and then putting the element there. So you need to pull it back a little bit. We can move elements with transform. We can rotate them, actually rotate, scale them bigger or smaller. We can also move them with translate. So we want to pull them back by half its own size actually. That's how it works, a bit of an advanced trick. If you do that, it will now be perfectly centered. Right, so this percentage here refers to its own size. A bit of an advanced trick. I'll maybe make this a little bit bigger. Okay, now this should also get a background color of just pure black. So we can just use hashtag 000. It should take up the complete width and also the complete height of its parent element, and the color of that X should be white. And actually it should be a little bit see-through. So let's actually just make an RGBA, and to get white you use 255 everywhere. And now let's make it something like 80% or maybe 85%. Now you can see because of this background color, this element does not have a border radius. So here it's just overflowing that. So we get these pointer border again. So we want to go to transaction and we want to say everything that overflows in should be hidden. Okay. Now initially this button should sit higher, right? So here, when we hover it, it comes down, right? So initially it should sit higher here. So we need to move it. And we were already moving it here to position it in the center. The first one is for the horizontal movement. The second one is for the vertical movement. If we make this, for example, negative 80%, it will sit a little bit higher. But if we make it negative 100%, it's going to sit there. So we just need to sort of make it sit completely out of view. Right, so now it's gone. And now when we hover the transaction element, should it come down? Right, so now we can also select the transaction in the hover state. When we hover that, then select the transaction __ btn. Right, and what we want to do here is we want to change the transform property to what we had before, to negative. This should be negative 50%. So now if you hover this, you should see the button again, right? Now this is instant, so it instantly comes down. Now if we want to make a change in the property smooth, we can use transition here, and we can say any property that gets changed should not happen instantly, should happen in, let's say, 0.3 seconds. Right, so now it's a smooth animation or transition. And it looks pretty cool, I think. And let's also add the cursor pointer here, just in a normal rule set for the button. Right, so now we also get this for the cursor. All right, looks pretty cool, I think. All right, so then we do need to make sure that this number sits on the right side here. It's sitting against the description now. So that's a layout problem. So let's see. We have this amount here. The parent element is transaction. So let's see, transaction, we can say display flex. Okay, now we can, it's a horizontal issue, so we can use justify content here. And previously we've always used center, but there are actually other values as well, like space around and space between is actually what we want here. It will add as much space between them as possible. All right, so this looks pretty cool so far. Now, of course, in the example here, it's sitting at the top here. And this is a bit tricky, actually. This is also a layout issue. So let's see, this transactions section and this app here, their parent element is the body. Okay, so the body actually already has display flex, and we're aligning it in the center now. So maybe we can also align it at the start, meaning this, right, the start of the vertical axis. And so then it's going to sit like this. Now we want it to be centered vertically, or at least it shouldn't sit against the top here. So the easiest way would just be to add some padding to the top here. of, let's say, 300 pixels perhaps. That's a bit much. Let's make it 100 pixels. Right, so now I would say this is fine. Now in the example, I made it centered vertically. That's a little bit more complicated here. It doesn't really matter. We can play around with this to get the exact same. Now, if you really want to center it perfectly, we shouldn't do it with padding top. So let's remove this. We should wrap the app and the transaction section, this section here, in another element. Let's call that a div with class of wrapper. Now, since it's so common to create divs, you can also just write dot and then the class name. As tab, it will actually just give you a div by default because the divs are so common. And then you can select all of this here, the app and the transaction section. I've selected all of this, then I'm going to hold Alt up arrow key to move it one line, and then it's in this wrapper element. So now it's already getting complicated. So now what we're going to do, now it's all screwed up, but that's okay. And now we're going to go to this wrapper element. We're going to select the wrapper, and we want them to sit next to each other, right? So we're going to say display flags, and we need to give this a height of 490 pixels. And what we're going to do is this app should just take up whatever the height of its parent element is, which is the wrapper. It should become 100%. And here, I set this to start here. We need to undo this to center. Okay, so now you can see it's all centered, and the app is just going to be 100% of that wrapper element, which is 490 pixels. And because of that wrapper element, this is now also sitting at the top here. Right, so that's a bit cumbersome. And the only way that you're going to know this is by really practicing a lot with Flexbox. So definitely check out my CSS course if you want to master those concepts, like Flexbox and CSS Grid, which we haven't even used here. CSS Grid is something that you want to use in very specific circumstances, usually for example, if you have a dashboard layout or some kind of a gallery with images, it's usually quite rare that you need it. Most of the time you want to use Flexbox. It's easier to work with, and CSS Grid is just a bit too complicated for the vast majority of layout problems. So you want to default to using Flexbox. Right, but also animations and transitions. We've used some simple transitions here, but can get much more complicated. So let's actually look at how we can make this a little bit more interesting. We can also add an intro animation. Right, so the first step would be to add the steps of the animation. Right, so we've seen transitions now, but we also have animations. And we use so-called keyframes for that. So let's add a section here in our style sheet called keyframes. So we would say add keyframes. We can give it a name. Right, keyframes are just the steps of an animation. So we can say at 0% of the animation we should do something, and at 100% of the animation should we do something. Right, so here, let's see. So maybe initially the opacity should be 0, right? And then at the end, the opacity should be 1, let's say. So these are just the steps right now. And now we can apply these steps to an element, right? So maybe even the app, right? So we could say animation, well, which steps? Well, we call that fade in. And how long should it take to go from that 0% to 1%? Well, let's make it 0.5 seconds. Right, so now you can see it's fading in the opacity. Right, this is already a little bit more complicated. Now we can even make it cooler. We can even use transform here, and we can make it sit initially a bit lower, so 15 pixels lower, and then at the end it should just be at its normal position, so 0 movement, not negative not negative to sort of compensate for this. No, it should be 0 movement, so just 0 pixels or just 0. And it already has these styles applied. So now if I refresh here, you can see it has a pretty cool sort of intro animation. And you can make it even cooler. We can also scale elements together here. So you can just write that here in the same line. So initially it should become a bit smaller, so 80% or 0.8, and then at the end it should just be 1% again. So now if we do this, you can see it has a pretty cool intro animation, right? Now here in the project, in the actual project, we don't want to add it to the app, although we certainly could. We can even add it to everything here, to the whole wrapper. Right, so you can just copy this. Now everything will sort of have a cool intro. Now, here in the project, we're just adding it to the transaction items. So as you add an item, for example, it will get a sort of cool intro into this list, right? So here we're not using JavaScript, so we're not going to make this work. So maybe just leave it here. You know, in the real world, after you added the JavaScript, it would look pretty cool if you add a transaction here, and it would sort of fade in as a new item here. So let's just add it here. So I'm going to remove it here, and we'll go to the transaction selector, and we'll add it here. Now, by the way, sometimes it looks a bit strange, but it's simply because we're using live server, or even without using live server, it can look a bit strange, but that's simply because the browser may need some time to apply the CSS properly. But now if you reload it, you can see the actual effect, right? So I think it will look pretty cool once you've got the JavaScript working. If you submit a new transaction item, that it gets added to the list with that animation, right? But if you want to do that, of course, you're going to have to learn about JavaScript as well, which I have a separate video on. Now, I also have a JavaScript course. If you don't want to waste any time, just go straight to my JavaScript course or my CSS course if you want to master CSS. But well done for making it this far. There was already, you know, some pretty advanced topics here that we've seen, but this is a really good overview of how HTML and CSS work. And I highly recommend you check out my CSS and JavaScript courses if you want to take those skills to an advanced level. Now we're not completely finished here. There's one more thing that I want to show you, which is responsiveness. So this right now looks good on a wider viewport. What if we are using a mobile phone, for example, right? Of course, this type of application, you know, you could definitely use on a phone, right? So we need to make it look good across other devices as well. So what we want to do is we want to right click, inspect, and here you can play around with the width of the viewport, right? So on a phone, the viewport is going to be more narrow, right? And we can see the dimensions here, right? So we can play around with the width. Now we can see, for example, that at some point it's going to look bad, right? So on a smaller phone, it's going to look like this. We don't want that. So we need to change the layout here a little bit as it gets more narrow. So you need to pick a point at which point you want to change something. This is called the breakpoint. So I'm gonna pick 800 here. Could also pick 801 or 799. You don't really, it doesn't really matter what the exact breakpoint is, but you know, let's just use round numbers here. So let's see. So at 800 in size, at 800 we want to change the layout here to a more vertical flow. Let's say. Let's see. We're gonna go at the bottom here. We're gonna write a so-called media query. So we're gonna say add media, and then the condition here. When the width is at most 800 pixels, we want to apply some styles here. So what we want to do is just a couple of things to get that vertical flow. So that wrapper element, which holds this app and the transactions section here, it's a flex container, so it has display flex, and the default is that they sit next to each other on a row. We can change the flex direction now, so it will still keep all of its styles, but you're just overriding something here or adding new decorations here. And so now when we do this, we get this vertical flow. Now it runs into an issue here because we set a height. So we just want to undo that. We want to undo that height issue. And then we also want to add a gap between this app and the transaction section. So since we're using Flexbox, we can use row gap, 20 pixels. Okay. And we also want to add some margin on top and bottom. So it's not going to sit so close to the edges. So 50 pixels on top and bottom and 0 pixels on the right and left side. Okay, now this app is now a bit too short, which means that this form is going to sit right against the overview. So we need to set a height here manually of 490 pixels now on the app. And that's all we want to do at this breakpoint. And so now you can see on wider viewports it's going to look like this. If the user is using a tablet, for example, or maybe a very small laptop or a phone, it's going to look like this. Now the transaction section still has some margin on the left. Right, so we also want to undo that. We don't want it to sit awkwardly like that. Transactions section, margin, left, 0. So if you do that, now it's sitting nicely aligned to the left here as well. Okay, now almost finished here. You know, at some point it's still gonna look, it's still gonna be a problem, right? So usually the smallest size that you want to support is about 320 pixels. So we do want to make sure that it looks good until then. So right now we still have this issue, right? So we still need to have another breakpoint, let's say 500, at which point we want to change something again. Right, so we're going to have one final media query here. So we're going to say when at media, when the width is at most 500 pixels, we want to apply some special styles, right? So you can also see this as a mini style sheet, right? So this is a mini style sheet only being applied when this condition is true, right? And this width here, by the way, is the size of is referring to the width of the viewport. Right, so this is the viewport, it's the visible area of the web page. It currently has these dimensions. It's different from the screen resolution, right? So my screen resolution is just the entire screen here, 1920 by 1080 pixels. But that's much bigger, that's different than the viewport here of this page, of this project, right? So when the viewport is 500 pixels or less, let's see what we want to do. We want to give this app the complete width here. So we don't want to see this background. It should just be the app itself entirely. So we're going to make this app. So we select .app. The width should be 100%. And we also want to remove its border radius. Right, so we're just going to set 0. Okay, so the width right now is not 100%. So let's see. So the percent refers to its parent element. And so the parent element here is this wrapper. So this should also be 100% here. Right, so here we can select the wrapper and we'll set the width to 100%. Yeah, so now it's taking up all this space here, and this wrapper has some margin on the top. So we'll say just margin 0. Okay, now we have a little bit of space here at the top. That's simply because this body is still aligning them with align items center. So it still tries to center them vertically here. So if we have some space vertical, it's still gonna center it vertically. So we want to undo that. So we'll just say align items, or we just want to say at the start. So they just should start at the start vertically. Right, so now it starts at the top here. Okay, then this transaction section, we also want that to span the entire width. So we'll say transactions section, this one, the width here should be 100% as well. Cool. And then we want to have this third heading in the center, let's say. That's the last thing we'll do. Third heading, text align, center. Right? But this is what we have right now, and I think this looks really cool, right? So on slightly wider, it still looks like this, and then on smaller devices like phones, we get a nice full width layout. Right, smallest size that you want to support usually is about 320 pixels. So this is what you would see, right? Of course, you can fine tune things, right? So here we have the sentence starts to break. You can, add additional media queries to really fine tune it, but this is good enough for this tutorial. All right, so let's see on iPhone 12 Pro, this is what you would see. And on a smaller iPhone, you would see this. Right, on iPad, Samsung Galaxy, right? Chrome and all the browsers, they give you some devices out of the box to test with. Right, so this is a quick way of making your project look good on other devices as well. So really well done for making it this far. Even with responsiveness, this is not easy stuff, right? You're going to spend a lot of time here in responsiveness to really undo certain things and to change things. So if you ran into any issues here, that's completely normal. But well done for making it this far.
By the way, if this was helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Also, check out my courses on CSS and JavaScript if you want to take those skills to an advanced level. Because in there, we will build some beautiful real-world projects from scratch so you can see how everything fits together and really master CSS or JavaScript. And I will also release other courses soon like React and Node.js. So if you want to be notified, then make sure you are subscribed to the email newsletter. You can find the link in the description. Thanks for watching and I hope to see you soon.